We did a number of interviews, radio and print back in those days. And this young woman just wanted to know, like, oh, this is terrible, people with no money and living on the streets. And Ted said, well, that's not always the case. He said, I'll give you an example. You're new at your job, yes. You're in your early 20s, yes. Got much money in the bank? I'm guessing not, no. Got a HECS debt from uni? Oh, yeah, that'll take a long time to pay off, right? You drive a car? Yes. I'm guessing you're paying that off? Oh, yes, I got a loan from my parents or something like that, and I'm paying that off. Great. And then unfortunately for her, he hit her with it and he said, you die tomorrow, you will be with me. There is nothing for you to pay a funeral unless someone else steps in, whether it be your parents or an aunt or an uncle, in many cases, the thing that we're seeing these days is we have many generations of people with not enough money or no money.
Welcome to Don't Be Caught Dead, a podcast encouraging open conversations about dying and the death of a loved one. I'm your host, Catherine Ashton, founder of Critical Info, and I'm helping to bring your stories of death back to life. Because while you may not be ready to die, at least you can be prepared. Don't Be Caught Dead acknowledges the lands of the Kulin Nations and recognises their connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and First Nation peoples around the globe. Kieran Worthington is the Director of Potters Fields Funerals and Bereavement Assistance League. Kevin Hartley is the founder of Natural Burial Ground Trust of Australia and a Director of Sustainable Funerals Group. Kieran comes from a diverse background of various business experience, from small family business through to multinational companies. Kieran has acquired a large repertoire of skills that he uses to benefit his business ventures and charitable pursuits. Strategising and guiding growth for charitable funerals for 27 years has allowed Kieran to visualise a social enterprise model that is designed to support charitable endeavours. Kevin Hartley has more than 25 years of diverse experience in the funeral and cemetery industries, giving him a broad and deep understanding of the sector. Kevin has founded and operated funeral businesses, managed cemetery and crematoria, won awards for innovative bio-coffin designs, and is considered an authority on natural burials. Our conversation today centred around the growing issue of funeral poverty and debt, particularly among vulnerable populations, highlighting the need for alternative funeral services that cater to financial and emotional needs. Thank you for joining me, Kieran and Kevin. I really have to ask, where were you a year ago when we had our friend die? His son and daughter had to crowdfund for his funeral. And I now realise, had we been speaking with you or known about your services, we may not have actually had to do that situation. Can you tell me a little bit about that, Kieran?
Yeah, to answer your question, we unfortunately for you, we're right where we've always been, except you just didn't know about us. And that's really the problem with smaller charitable organisations that are effectively trying to make a dent in the problems of populations the size of Melbourne and others. We're in our 27th year. We let everyone know that we can via a website, via contacts in the industry, by hospices, hospitals, community groups. We let them know that we're here. People don't tend to think about death very much, so then they forget that you're available when the time comes, and it all feels rushed and pressured at the time. So people make their own opportunity by using a commercial provider. And that's all fine and good if that's something you can afford. However, a lot of people can't afford that. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. However, we're down in Oakley. We've been here for over 15 years in this location. We've been around for 27 years in other locations prior to that. We are available to people and we can help.
Maybe, Catherine, the answer to the question is a bit more universal one as well, which is that deaths, whether expected or not, when they arrive, the panic button in your brain gets hit and there's all these decisions to be made. And if you haven't been literate around death and the end-of-life services that are available, you wouldn't know. There's probably a stack of commercial funeral directors whose name you don't know. So it's not surprising you wouldn't know about the work of bereavement assistance. One of the things I'm very happy to be here today, and thank you for having us, is to support what you're doing, which is through Critical Info. You're looking to get people to think ahead. And this is one of the most useful things you can possibly do, I think, for anyone around this space. Because even when someone knows someone's going to die, you really don't want to address it, or many people don't. You want that to maybe not be right, or you're waiting for a miracle, or maybe there's going to be a change, or you think I'll deal with that when the thing comes. I won't think it's going to happen because that's somehow tempting fate. So people find themselves in the exact situation you find yourself in all the time, that you didn't know about bereavement assistance. So there's many funeral directors you wouldn't know about either. But I think the situation your friends found themselves in is the reason that bereavement assistance was founded. And Kieran could probably speak about what used to be called pauper funerals in Victoria, and the name isn't good, and nor was what was happening. And that was something that Kieran and his father and Kieran, in that order, set out to address. You want to talk about that a bit, Kieran?
Sure thing. So my father, Ted Worthington, was a funeral celebrant, as we used to say. Well, he's a celebrant, which means he could marry you or he could bury you. And he found himself coming across people in desperate need of somebody to help with funerals. So he was doing them himself, and they couldn't really afford to pay a commercial rate for a funeral, which anyone who is attempted to do so in recent times has discovered is very, very expensive, $6,000, $8,000, $20,000, $50,000 for very high-end funerals. This is not uncommon. So he was taking care of that out of his own pocket and his own time, and whatever he could negotiate from a funeral home, a second's coffin or something like that. It's pretty raw stuff, but it was necessary. A very close friend of his said to him that, look, this really needs to be a charitable endeavour, and was willing to support it with a little bit of seeding money. And that person became one of the founding members, along with myself and my father, my mother, and one other fellow who was a CPA. So Ted's idea of helping Victorians was born, and it was, coming on for 27 years ago that happened. Bereavement Assistance Limited was created. Ted and myself and a fellow by the name of Bernard were the founding directors, and Ted drove it with all his energy and his ability, with us in the background assisting for many years until his health declined. And then I took it on as my own to try and keep the legacy alive, and so far still going strong.
What do you think, Kieran, was the actual motivator for Ted to set up that organisation? Was it a particular incident that happened, or...?
Ted had always instilled in my brother and I a sense of community. You're nothing without your community. There's only so long. Man is not an island, as they say. There's only so long you can last if you don't have assistance when you need it, and therefore it's important that you're there for others when they need you. So we understood that early days growing up. We assisted him with several fundraising events for people who were in need, unrelated to this industry. Ted always had a sense of fair play, very strong sense of fair play, and liked to see that everyone got an opportunity to do what they needed to do, or to be looked after if they needed it. So that's what drove him as a person, and still to this day does. What he found that was really touching his heart, and then the heart of our patron, Mick Miller, ex-Police Commissioner for Victoria, who also assisted us and stayed patron for 22 years until he passed away. What touched them was finding that there were people that were slipping through even the cracks of the system that were designed to help them. They'd find ex-servicemen that were effectively pauper funerals with nobody helping, when in fact there was a system in place to assist them financially if necessary. They just didn't know about it. No one that they knew could tell them about it or get them connected. So I think that was one of the key things for Ted and Mick Miller at the time, to really get them fired up into figuring out how to provide a service that people could access. One of the things that we need to do better, admittedly, is get the word out in a way that makes sense. Good news is social media has the ability to do that, and that's something we're now utilising. But for many years, at least the first couple of decades, we'd often hear of people saying, we didn't know you were here, we wish we did. You've just articulated that same issue for yourself. It just seemed like no matter how many people you tell, people tend to forget. And then when it comes time, they don't know what to do, so they just refer it on. Coroner being the first entity that touches somebody who is in need, or the police. Anyhow, he was sufficiently motivated to talk about it with a number of friends. And as you said, there was a very good close friend who was a benefactor who provided a little seed money to get this going. And so here we are now doing that good work still.
I think, Kevin, you actually alluded to it. When someone dies, you're not in the right frame of mind to be researching what your options are. You generally go with what the family already knows, what's familiar to you. So I think that was something in hindsight that we did, is that we thought we'd just go with the family thought that they would go with the organisation that had done the older brother's funeral, which I think is a very normal thing, or a very usual thing that sort of happens in families. Would that be correct in saying that?
Absolutely, Catherine. A death occurs and everything goes topsy-turvy. You press the pause button on your life, and then you're wondering, what do I do now? And lack of information or being unsure makes you scared, and what makes you feel better is something that you're familiar with. So yes, the Fred Smith funerals did Granddad's funeral 20 years ago. Let's just go there. This is the quick fix to feeling scared or feeling uncertain. And if you add on to the top of that the issue of, that we're talking about today, which is folk who are struggling financially, put that on the top of it, it almost doesn't matter where they go. There's the additional layer of problem that comes in. And one of the founding blocks of Kieran's family and Ted's service of bereavement assistance was what has always existed in some form, as a pauper funeral, which was the provision of the absolute minimum amount of money possible from the government to simply dispose of the body. And I use that terminology rather than have a funeral, just bury the body or burn the body. That was basically what was being provided to people before Ted stepped in. What he said was, well, it doesn't, we're all members of society and it doesn't matter who it is. And if it happens at that point in your life when you die, you happen to be financially broke, and that can happen to people. There's people who are rich when they're 20 and broke when they're 30. To have that sort of funeral isn't a good reflection of our society. I think there's a sort of a famous saying that, if you want to see how a society operates, have a look at how it treats its poor people and its dead. So that was a pauper funeral is about as undignified as you get. And what bereavement did through its work, as Kieran's outlined, was to establish a charity, find some funding sources so that people were given funerals that were very similar, if not identical, to a commercial funeral, but either at a greatly subsidised or in some cases fully subsidised cost. And that work's still going on today. Nothing's changed. And if anything, the environment, post-COVID, the economic crisis that we're in now, skyrocketing interest rates, that problem's only getting worse.
Talking openly about death and grief can sometimes be triggering. If you find you need support, please reach out to our support services and the bereavement organisations listed on our resource hub. All links are in the show notes of this episode. And can you tell me what is on offer today, and how do people, when they come to you, what happens? Talk me through that process.
Yes, no problem at all. I might just add to Kevin's comments first,
Sure.
if I can. Our patron, Mick Miller, what a wonderful fellow he was. He ran our police force for over 10 years. He was a detective before that for a couple of decades. Very good man to go to talk to understand the breadth of the problems that society has naturally, given the role he played, and how they could be solved or at least alleviated, sometimes mitigated. One of his favourite sayings for what we were doing was that we bring dignity in death to those that may not have known it in life. And I think that's a great, way to sum up what Kevin was saying. It was a pretty ordinary situation that Victorians had to deal with, very hard on families that didn't really understand death and what's involved in moving forward from the part where someone has ended their life, naturally or otherwise, and quite a shock when they found out how simple and basic and raw the system actually was, that a very modern and you would say wealthy society by many international standards was still working at such a very low level. So what can we do? That's important. We can take care of people no matter how much money they have. If they have enough money for a very basic, fully paid funeral, we can get that done for them. If they are short on that, we can assist with some government funding that will bring them to a level that is a simple service, a cremation, a burial if there is a space already set aside. Burial plots are very expensive, but some families actually have them bequeathed to them or left over from earlier purchases, and we can assist there. People who come to us typically are finding that affordability of a funeral is the problem. Most funeral homes will start at around $6,000 to $8,000 for a basic funeral service. That'd be an all-inclusive, but it's very, very basic, and then they head up north from there very quickly as soon as you want anything. So in terms of what we offer, we offer a range of opportunities for people depending on what their financial circumstances are. If somebody has a little money but not quite enough for a commercial funeral, we can do something to help them out for sure. If there's less money than that, the government provides some funding that we're allowed to utilise to help them. And in the case of some very unfortunate and destitute people, if they have literally not a cent to their name, we can take care of a very basic cremation for them, along with some dignified words and provide the ashes back to them. This is done with the help of the state government in the form of the coroner and some funding to make that work. The important thing here is that people feel like there was at least some dignified finish to that person's life, even if they hadn't led a very happy or good one. We don't discriminate. We take all comers, so to speak.
And Kieran, on that, sorry, but so the people that come to mind that I'm thinking of, and I've read a bit of services that are similar to this in the UK and America. They're obviously a little bit different, but where they offer cremation services for people that have been unclaimed, I believe, in the UK or similar in the States. So I'm thinking that the sort of people that you may see are perhaps homeless people who have lived by themselves, may not have any family. But at the same time, having said that, you know, I think about our circumstance last year, and it was a matter of how much money is in the bank account. It doesn't matter how much, is in assets. It was actually about that liquid form to actually pay for the funeral bill that was what is the deciding factor. Is that true to see?
Yeah, this is very much true. I think people imagine that charity is homeless people needing blankets and food and that sort of thing. And of course, that's very much part of it. But so many more people are affected these days and in need of charitable support. People with jobs, people who just literally struggling just to keep food on the table for their children or pay the mortgage, the rent in many cases. A great example would be in the early days, Ted was interviewed by a young woman who was a new journalist. She'd just gotten out of uni and it was one of her first jobs. And we did a number of interviews, radio and print back in those days. This was before the advent of social media. And this young woman just wanted to know, like, oh, this is terrible, people with no money and living on the streets. And Ted said, well, that's not always the case. And he said, I'll give you an example. You're new at your job, yes. You're in your early 20s, yes. Got much money in the bank? I'm guessing not, no. Got a HECS debt from uni? Oh, yeah, that'll take a long time to pay off, right? You drive a car? Yes. I'm guessing you're paying that off. Oh, yes, I got a loan from my parents or something like that, and I'm paying that off. Great. And then unfortunately for her, he hit her with it and he said, you die tomorrow, you will be with me. There is nothing for you to pay a funeral unless someone else steps in, whether it be your parents or an aunt or an uncle. In many cases, the thing that we're seeing these days is we have many generations of people with not enough money or no money in some cases. These people often are in the welfare system and have been generation, mothers, grandmothers, grandfathers, and therefore the grandchildren struggle to hold jobs, struggle to fit into the society that they find themselves born into, and therefore have no knowledge of how to manage money, let alone get it. As we all know, you need a job, you need to get paid, then you need to pay bills, and you hope you make more than the bills you pay. That's not the case for a lot of people. Those are the folks that we're helping.
And a lot of the
I
time,
think
I'm sure, sorry, Kevin, but a lot of the time I'm sure that you actually see that perhaps is also a result of intergenerational trauma as well.
Yeah, Kevin can probably talk a little bit to that. He's very familiar with this problem with society. Yeah,
absolutely, Catherine. There are families who've been in receipt, living on social security for 3 generations, and it's not an indictment of them. It's there. It simply is in any society. There is certain people who don't fit into the middle of the machine, and we in our society, if you want to be in the middle class or in just in the way things work, you've got a job, you've got a mortgage, you've got all these bits and pieces. Some people just can't do that. They just don't understand it, can't do it emotionally, psychologically, practically, or physically. I think this is interesting. I'm listening to you and Kieran talk backwards and forwards, and it might sound, or someone listening to this podcast might think that, oh, okay, so there's this service out at Oakley that's for people who are absolutely living on the street and destitute. But that's changed. I think certainly that was part of it in the early stages, as I understand from talking with Ted and Kieran. But today there are people who've got good paying jobs and 3 children and 2 kids in school and mortgages. And if they got hit with a funeral debt, they would be an example of that person that Kieran was just talking about, the young woman interviewing. An unexpected debt when you're teetering on the edge of what you can pay for pushes you over the edge. And that's what we're now seeing more and more, is a change in the interest in the people who are inquiring into funerals. And they're going, oh, okay, I'm in a place where, yes, I can pay my bills tomorrow. So they might fall through the cracks. And I mean, that's something that we're currently looking at. We're looking at, Kieran's talked about the last 27 years of helping Victorians. We're focused now on the next 27 and what those problems are, because the problems change, times change. There's a need there, I think, for a different form of funeral entirely than perhaps what the commercial funeral directors are offering people, so that there's a midpoint where people who are struggling financially but wouldn't meet the criteria for a government-assisted funeral or a bereavement assistance funeral, that they might have some other option. And that's where we're focused at present, is we're trying to work out where that goes.
You're so right there, Kevin, because I know from my car accident, our world changed pretty much instantaneously. I was fortunate that I was in a government job at that stage and I had long service leave, but it only takes one incident like that and it can change the whole rest of your life. So I'm not surprised that you're seeing a shift with what you're going to have to deal with in relation to your clients for the next 27 years. And can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, Catherine, I think that's a great segue to talk about a term that was born in the UK called funeral poverty. And if you take that situation we just described and then you put a family in a situation, the breadwinner dies, quickly gets sick, heart attack, whatever, there's the family. Suddenly the income is about to dry up. There's probably, some long service leave or some holiday leave or some bonus payments or a bit of life insurance or something. And that family then are faced, if they fall into the trap of not having thought about what the funeral is and really assessing and going, you know what, if we spend a lot of money on this funeral, we're going to be in a worse place than we are. And heaven forbid they spend all the money they've got, or worse, go into debt to do this. And fortunately, and I'm not going to say, not going to tar all commercial funeral directors with the same brush, but it has been it's not uncommon for funeral directors to help arrange finance for funerals. And what you're doing is putting people in a position where they're going into debt, buying services at a time when they're potentially not in the best frame of mind to assess whether those services are really what they want, whether they're essential, whether they're extravagant, and they just are led to some degree. And then you've got the grief of the funeral, the loss of your life, the changes to your existence, and you've got a debt. And that's been a topic that we've been at our board levels and discussions working through diligently in the last months, going, you know what, there's people who are about to fall into that trap, who today look like they're holding it all together, and tomorrow, as you say, Catherine, you've explained your history with having a serious accident that changed your life. There's people out there today who'll have events like that tomorrow where there's a death and they potentially end up in debt, which is then, and grief is a complicated thing, and complicated grief exists. It's 2 things, and you put in debt and then you put in extra debt, and And every time you look at that debt, you're not thinking about the passing of the person, you're thinking about the debt that went along with their death. So then you've got a double whammy of psychological trauma that's coming along there. So it's a real trap. And I think something that the original bereavement assistance offering has done is, to some great degree over the last years, has given an option, for at least for the people who knew about the service, not to end up in that situation. But I think we need to do more, actually.
What sort of discussions are you having at that board level when you're looking at what you offer and considering your thoughts on funeral poverty? What services do you see changing over the next few years?
Great question. We're probably a little premature, but to go to detail, Catherine, maybe we leave you with the thought, though, that we feel like there's an opportunity or the potential to address a whole sector of the community in Victoria who wouldn't normally consider seeking services with a group like Bereavement Assistance or the Sustainable Funeral Group. But by producing funerals of a different nature, a funeral where families are much more involved, funerals where families are coordinating some activities or crafting their own funeral perhaps, and us providing them with the pieces of professional or specific information and experience and equipment that they wouldn't generally have access to. Is that a fair description, Kieran? I'm not sure how far you want to go there describing.
No, I think that's fair and right to talk about. I mean, the reality we have is that, once upon a time there was a middle class. I ain't seeing much of a middle class anymore. I would have considered myself one of them once, but there are times when I've had to find ways to create money to pay some additional bills I didn't see coming. It's the truth of it, There's no shame in it. The reality is we plan the best we can and we sometimes fall short. What that's opened up is an area where people who are going to be hit with a very quick, large bill are going to need another option. I'll give you this as an example. I know a fellow that, for whatever reason, found himself homeless all of a sudden with 4 children and a car that had a dodgy transmission. He needed help. I could see this thing spiraling terribly for him as soon as that car wouldn't drive anymore. He had children to get to school. He had doctor's appointments for one of them was sick. He had to find a way to get work and get himself there. This is dire stuff, okay? But once upon a time, a man that owned a car and had children and an income and was moving along in life was considered middle class or lower middle class at worst. This fellow was on the edge of destitution. If someone had died, he couldn't afford a funeral. So what he might have been able to do, though, is do something to help himself with the funeral. And therefore, if we provided that assistance, he could have gotten away with it for a much cheaper price that he could manage, that he could do. If he could afford a $2,000 transmission, he might have been able to afford a funeral with someone like us if we had the system in place. So we're talking about how we might be able to help people who have found themselves just without the extra money required for a lump sum commitment at a short space of time. And we're going to pull this off. We'll be able to do this because we've been around long enough to know what to do. We just have to get the right funding in place to make sure we've got equipment ready and people ready to help those folks. This is only going to get worse. I know this for a fact. I talk with people regularly about non-funeral related things because I have a great interest, like everyone, in trying to pay a mortgage or mortgages if you've ever invested in property. And everybody is struggling. They don't know. They're having to sell. They don't know what to do. And therefore, that tells me that bit of cash they had set aside has now been soaked up by the interest rate rises, and therefore they can't afford 5, 6, 10 grand all of a sudden. They're keeping their cars longer. Those cars are getting worn out and old because they can't afford to replace the cars, those sorts of things. This is the reality of what we're living in. This is the majority of our population. This is no longer the small niche piece, typically you would find in the lower socioeconomic group that we would help. We are now helping people all the way up through to what used to be called middle class. They're just running out of money. We are trying to stop the cycle of debt the best we can, and we'll continue to do so. So we will innovate products so that we can help people do that.
And I know that we personally knew 3 people who died last year because of that they had to crowdfund for their funeral. And that's just us knowing 3 people. So I'd hate to think, with you being in the industry, how many people and how many stories that you've heard, especially over the last 12 months, as you mentioned, with the interest rates. Something that I have heard conversations about also is people wanting to reclaim. I had an interview with Rebecca Lyons from the Australian Home Funeral Alliance, and she is instrumental in that alliance is instrumental in helping people reclaim funerals within the home and, taking on ownership of certain parts of the funeral. Is that something that you would have seen in your experience, people wanting to be more involved and more family-centred services?
I think there's a sector of people in the community who want to do that. I don't think it's a thing that everyone wants to do, even if they were fully informed. There's great individual variance is an absolute. Everyone's different, what we can handle, what we want, what we feel is meaningful to do. Someone writing a eulogy, that might be as a brilliantly powerful contribution to a funeral, but as far as they go, and if you said to them, why don't you come down to the mortuary and help us put Grandad in the coffin, that might be just so far out of their field of comfort that it would be outrageous. I know Beck Lyons. I'm very familiar with her work. She's a very smart and passionate person. The idea of family being involved in funerals is something that's always in any funeral business I've been associated with over 30 odd years. We're open to that. And I think this may be part of the solution for people who find themselves not destitute in the old terms, where they absolutely need the original sort of services that we've been offering at Oakley, but people who find themselves in that halfway mark where they need to find a cost-effective way to have a funeral that's meaningful for their family. And yeah, we talk about funerals being expensive, and in some ways they are, and in some ways they aren't. I had a relative who just had my sister actually, one of her children married, and I know what the bill for the wedding was. And compared to most funerals, it'd stagger you. So life events are expensive. They just are, things cost money. If people can afford funerals and want particular trappings or events or locations or the things that's absolutely just, if that's meaningful for them. There's very few people who don't want anything, who genuinely just go, we just need to dispose of the body and have no service, because this is a social thing, Catherine. So it's built into our DNA. I'm sure if you went back, there's no evidence of this, but I'm going to posit for a moment. And I'm sure if you went back to the cavemen, and there's a family of 10 living in a cave, and one morning they get up and Ert doesn't move, and someone goes over and prods Ert, they might not even understand that Ert died, but I bet you a quid to a dollar that they all sat down around Ert and went, and they stopped everything else they were doing for a while. And they thought about it, and they realised that something had changed. And that's the origin of a funeral. That's what we're doing today. We're stopping and realising. And so this is built into us. We want and need to have these things. If the commercial funeral market is such that it makes people want to buy things, and this is the commercial world we live in, and we're bombarded with stuff all the time, buy this, you need this, people identifying problems we don't have and creating products to fill them. People think about a funeral, they go, a funeral is this, I've got to have one of those. And it's up to us, I think, and particularly in this charitable space, to take ideas and nuances and the feelings of things like Beck's doing with family-led funerals and say, well, that's great. How can we bring that so that everyone can have access to that? Or more specifically, everyone who wants that. Because there'll always be people who'll go, you know what, we really did love the funeral that Smith and Jones Funerals did for us. We want that for Grandad as well as Grandma. And we've got the money to pay for it, and that's how we want to handle it. And no, we don't want to go and dress the deceased but yes, we do want to write the eulogy. And yes, I do want to make the flowers from my garden. And I think everyone's different. And what's the last probably 30 years of funerals has been is that, and people use the cookie cutter expression, funerals come out of a bit of a mould. Most people wouldn't experience this, but as funeral directors, I remember going to a crematorium one day and being there with the one company years ago, 5 funerals, 1 hour, basically an hour apart. And I couldn't help thinking, gee, these are all exactly the same, just moving people. If that's the sort of funeral a family want, if that's meaningful for them, that's fine. But I think the world is changing, and I think people are much more adept at working out what they can and can't contribute. And I use that word crafting. We love craft beer. I think people can get involved in craft services and the social aspect of funerals that they want. And this might be the place where an organisation like ours that has a charitable base, and we're not government funded, but we have some government support, where we can take use our facilities and avail those to a wider sector of the community, so that we can help people with things that are very difficult for someone to do. It's very difficult for people to move a deceased person unless you've got some equipment and a vehicle. You're right. You asked a question earlier, Catherine. Do people want to be more involved? I dealt with a lovely lady who'd had a horrible year with her husband dying, and she wanted to be involved in everything. And I spent a couple of hours with her, and we eventually got to an understanding that it just wasn't possible. She wanted to move her husband from this place of death. Well, where is he? He's on the 4th floor. How are you going to do that? Well, I've got a little sedan. Well, who's going to help you do that if you want to do it yourself? And it wasn't that she was a very smart woman, but she was in grief. So she wanted that involvement. She wanted to do those things. But even in grief, with a sensible conversation, she came to understand that there were aspects that just weren't logistically easy. If you can't have the funeral the next day, you're going to need somewhere for that deceased person to be, in a professional refrigerated mortuary facility. That's not something you have in your backyard. But these are all the things that we have and we've been using for years to help people. So we take those facilities and then open that wider so that we can bring people and let them craft the kind of funerals are, and then provide them with the essential elements that they can't easily do or provide for themselves. Because it's one thing to... I'm belittling a little, a sort of a romantic idea of a very simple claim the funeral back for yourself. But in the practical modern age we live in, that's damn near impossible. Most people are going to need a little bit of help somewhere. How much help they need will depend on the family. And I think if we're able to, as a charitable group, find a way to bridge that gap between people who are able to pay for a funeral and therefore choose what they want, absolutely not able to pay and need substantial assistance. And this emerging group now in between, who are, as we say, we've discussed at length here, on the edge of financial fragility, for want of a better word, to give them an option that allows them to put in what they don't have money, but they do have their effort and their time and their willingness. So they contribute to one of the biggest costs in funerals, which is labour. The people who work in funerals are dedicated, hard-working people who do a hard job. But you know what? They've got mortgages and children and cars and transmissions that break down. They've got to be paid as well, and that applies in a charitable setting as well. So if the industry to enable for us as even as a charitable trading enterprise, for us to be there, we've got to be able to pay the bills. So we need to cover those costs, but those costs then give us the ability to have those facilities that people could use, and we could open that up. And that's where we're heading, Catherine. We think we're going to be able to help people get funerals at cost.
And tell me, who do you think a funeral is for? Do you think it's for the living?
Personally? Or do
you think it's for the person who's died?
It's only for the living, Catherine, in my personal view. Can't be for anyone else. The deceased may have thought about it and planned it, but a plan is only a thought in the present moment about the future. Once that person's died, no one knows. We could speculate all day on what happens and whether there's a spiritual world or an afterlife. That's a speculation that we'll all have, but the one thing you can be certain of, 9 billion people on the planet and no one's getting out alive. That person has gone wherever that person's gone and we won't know. So the funeral is a social one. My caveman example, either was able to see what was going on or wasn't, and if he was able to see, he wasn't buying in as a participant. It was for the other people who were there, and they sat in that cave for a while, and then they went, oh, maybe we better take Ert outside. And 2 days later they went, maybe we better, there's a hole over here. Maybe we put earth in here and cover him with some earth. Or if they were a little bit more advanced and had a fire, maybe they built a bigger fire. That's I think that genuinely is the social origin of funerals. It is social, but it's very meaningful for us. It's right in our DNA because while, I've got dogs and one of the dogs have died over the years, the other dog will have a quick sniff and then run off and play with a ball. Human beings, we have a different form of intellect. We're able to see forward and see backwards. We remember and we cast our minds into the imagined future. And that makes us emotional. That makes us be able to remember what Ert meant to us when he went out and slew the saber-toothed tiger and saved us that day. And that's that's the stuff it's emotional to us. And the funeral is to address our feelings, our grief, to give us a pause for reality, a reality check. Oh, Ert's not here anymore. John's not here anymore. Grandma's not here anymore. That's the purpose of it. It's for me. I can't see.
I wonder if I could mention. Thank you, Kevin, for that little insight and how it occurs for you, because it just reminds me of what a skill it is for our funeral directors to take the vision of the deceased, what they wanted to see happen when they passed, take what the expectation of the family is, and find an acceptable, dignified blend of the two, so that works for all parties and the memory of what the deceased was wanting, because some things can't happen but most things usually can, and then the family have some slightly different ideas they'd like to incorporate. So the quality of our professionals, even in the charitable sense that not much money is being spent, is right up there alongside of the ones that work for the commercial providers. They've usually come from those industries originally. Often that's where their training was, and they were looking for a different way of continuing that work, a more community-based way. So they take the deceased wishes expressed by the family and also in the system. Often they come to us now and pre-plan what they want, so we know what they want, and then take what the family want and we blend it together in a way that everybody feels like they got what was right for the person who passed away. It's an incredibly gifted skill set that they have.
And do you think, Kieran, that there is a basic element of ritual that is undertaken as part of the funeral service that you see is consistently requested, regardless of whether someone can afford to pay for a funeral or they can't afford to pay for a funeral? What is the ritualistic elements that you think that are key that you've seen in that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It would have been answered differently 5 or 10 years ago by me. Probably is if there's an old radio program floating around or some print media that Ted and I had done. It's changed dramatically now. Once upon a time, you were either secular or religious. You wanted the church involved, and you wanted your priest to do the eulogy for you and those sorts of things. And you might have even wanted it in the church, and we do that as well. There's no problem. More and more we notice people are secular, that they don't have a particular religion. It doesn't mean they don't believe in God or a superior being, but they're not practicing any particular religion. And therefore, those rituals would seem similar then. They're not anymore. That people have an individualistic idea of what they think is fair and right for the person that passed. It may not necessarily always agree with that person either. They may have had certain wishes and the family wants something different. So we find that blend that makes sense for everybody, because it's very much about the living. It's the way to dignify the person's passing and provide a lovely memory for the family to go away and feel like they did right. It's important for families to feel like they did what they could and they did right by the person who passed away, because at that point you're largely remembering all the fun and wonderful things that person did in their life, either for you or for others. It's the nature of death, isn't it? We all of a sudden remember all the good times, and that's a good thing. So no, we don't have a specific thing that seems to come up too often, unless it's very religiously based, and then it's all very, very similar. Greek Orthodox, we do, Generally speaking, if it's church-based, it's very similar in that way. The ritual is similar, Catholic and whatnot. The secular stuff's interesting. It's part of our thinking, though, that we need to apply a level of flexibility around that for people. So certainly there are some things that are probably just too hard to do, but most things are doable in some way. And we like to be as flexible as we can with people's wishes, even the ones that can't afford very much. We like to see what we can do that personalises it for them so that they're left with that beautiful memory of it didn't matter that I didn't have enough money. There was no difference in how I honoured my mother when she left, that sort of thing.
I think a funeral, Catherine, what you're hoping for out the end of it is meaning. You're looking for something that's meaningful. And traditionally, this is what ritual did. Ritual provided meaning. It underpinned meaning for people, and it also takes an enormous amount of stress out of things. Orthodox religions and who have strict customs, the people engaged in the families engaged in the funeral are far less stressed than most of the rest of us because they know what's going to happen because it's happened for the last 1,000 years. And they're going to do it. And it might not seem as personal to us because, as Kieran alludes, we're in a very individualist age. You know, we're raised to think that we're in a single entity and we're important, and probably we're not, but there we go. That's how we're raised. Watching this as a provider of funerals, I'm seeing that I think it's becoming more difficult for people often to find that meaning in the absence of ritual. So again, I think that simply having a pause and a gathering is probably the common element of all funerals. Whether you sing a particular song or you march around the coffin holding incense for 2 hours on the night before, or you have holy water and blessings and olive oil and any of the various traditional customs, they're probably less important. But I think there's one of the things. This is an excellent point. One of the things that happens in the funeral industry commercially since it kicked off in the late 80s with the advent of simplicity funerals, who were the original price discounters, is that people became more price sensitive on funerals. So now there's a whole group of people, and probably about 20%, who only look at the cost. And I think that's to their psychological and social detriment. If they're simply going to say, well, I'm going to have the absolute minimum service, I'm just going to have and this is not to say that this isn't right for some people, but to say, I'm not going to have a funeral service at all. What is there? What is there socially? Where's the meaning in that? Unless the person was just really terrible to them or something and they just wanted to get rid of them, I don't know. But ritual is powerful if it's meaningful to you, if it's part of your culture. If it isn't, it's purposeless. But I think in the absence of ritual, we need something else that gives meaning to the funeral. And it's the thing that gives meaning to suffering is sharing it. And that's you sit down with a group of people, or Urt and his family sit in the cave, or we gather at a crematorium. And this was the key thing that Ted Worthington and Kieran and his brother in following on have provided people is those original pauper funerals. There was no funeral. There was no service. So even if a person was homeless and had 3 homeless friends, those poor 3 homeless friends didn't even get the opportunity to make some meaning out of that person's death. So I as a social commentator, not a funeral director, because I don't think of myself quite so much as a funeral director anymore. We're in a charitable space now. Our job is to help people and help social stability and help the environment. But I as a social commentator, I think if we just chase price, which then means less and less service and less possibility of meaningful service, I think we're doing an injustice. Not judging people who do that. That's a personal choice and individual variance is guaranteed. But I think if we're not, as a society, and our part in that as a charity is to fill parts of societal lacks that perhaps government haven't seen yet or can't fill or other people don't want to fill, we need to fill that so that when people die, they have the opportunity at least to make some meaning of that death. Because otherwise, I think we're ending up with a whole group of scarred people out there, and they're probably not quite sure why they're scarred. Because a funeral is the start point in many senses for addressing the grief that comes with death.
Here's an interesting thing that crops up from what you're saying, Kevin, and that is that what I've noticed is ritual came about originally because it was usually around the honouring of a supreme being of some sort. And before Christianity, it was Ra and onward and so forth. Okay. It then became a way to avoid emotion. Inadvertently, I think, not deliberately. I think what it did it became the thing you did so you didn't have to think or feel about what had happened. Because if you can just say, oh, we go down to Smith and Son, they take care of it. They've done every generation of our family. There's an order to it. We know what it is. We just have to pick colours and flowers and bits. And whew, I don't have to think too much. I don't have to feel too much. I can worry about how I'm feeling later. And we go through this process as commercial funeral directors, which we've been, all of us at some point, and we say, okay, we're at that point now, and then something breaks, and it's usually right there in the service, and that's when the sobbing and the crying begins. Everyone would have seen that at a funeral, and that's because everything's been on hold up until that moment. And I think ritual's responsible for that. As comfortable as ritual is and as necessary as it seems that it's required, what we're now discovering is that in this individualistic society where people get to assert who they are and how they see themselves, they can become more involved in the funeral preparation from the beginning. And as they're doing the work with the funeral provider, they're beginning the grieving process, and it's coming out in bits and pieces of emotion here and there. It's feeding into the final result, which is the funeral, which is a beautiful thing because it's heartfelt and it's natural. But at the same time, it's alleviating the pressure for the person as they get involved. They think about the words. They start to write the eulogy with the funeral director. They don't just give them a few points and let them do it. They think about what sort of flowers, whether they're from the garden or they're from grandma's garden, those sorts of things, instead of just a flower provider at a price. They think about personalising coffins. We've done that for several people in the past, at personalised coffins, had all the kids sign a white coffin in coloured pens. We've done that for my own family members. And that begins to let that emotion start to escape and start to become real and become natural. And then by the time you get to the service, interestingly enough, not as much blow up, not as much explosion of crying and upset and grief and wailing, which can then trigger all sorts of uncomfortable feelings for people who weren't there and find themselves in that. I think getting involved and doing something about it is going to be the key to the future for people, because it will alleviate some of the pressure built by the grief. It'll let it out in pieces leading up to and then including the funeral. And then the tears are probably more gentle and more heartfelt than just explosions of emotion. No less meaningful.
I know.
In a way, then, Kieran, sorry, I'm just thinking about this as you're saying, as I don't think I've ever heard you say this before. So I'm guessing it's a new thought. In a way, the lack of ritual that I'm speaking about, you think that could be replaced by the engagement to make the preparation of the funeral the ritual, but rather than it being ritualised, it's a little more fluid?
Yes, I think so. I think that what this is becoming, that we're talking about it in our board meetings, and what we're trying to discover the ability for us to do and create on behalf of folks that want to, is a way for this to become a more cathartic exercise whilst honouring the person that they've lost. So it's all wrapped together in everyone comes out feeling better, given that something pretty awful has happened. Often death is unexpected. It's not expected. So this is a better outcome for society. Catherine, I'm going to pretend you asked me a question, if it's all right.
Sure.
Feel free to pop it in ahead when you edit. That's what works.
Or even better, don't, because if you keep this bit in, it'll be terrific.
Yeah, exactly.
Here's what we're doing that no one really understands and that we find it very difficult to put a measurement on. And I'm going to refer to that fellow that I was talking about, who is a real fellow, genuine fellow. Had his transmission gone in his car and he couldn't afford the $2,000 to replace it, because that was the cost, I knew that, and his car probably wasn't even worth that. He wouldn't be able to borrow the money or justify doing it, so he would be carless. He would have children to see to, schools to get them to, doctor's appointments. He would be so stressed, he would break down. When he breaks down, 4 children suffer. Those children are traumatised. Doesn't matter if it was meant or not. At least one of those children will have criminal intent sometime in their life and will act on it out of trauma. That act will then affect other people in society, you or me, in some way, via violence, theft, or otherwise. What we are doing is we're trying to kind of let some steam escape by taking care of the folks that are really so close to the edge that you don't know what's going to happen after this, and you don't know generationally what this is going to do if you don't help them when they need help. This is what TED was all about. It's about community. It's about helping the people in desperate need. And you might be that person one day and need that same help by somebody else. Bit of luck, you'd already helped them and they were keen to help you back. It's kind of like small town stuff, but it works. So you think about the greater effect of us ignoring the fact that there are people more and more now, and we're not just talking. Once upon a time in Victoria, it was tens of thousands and we would get a small percentage of that to help. We are now talking hundreds of thousands of people. You know, Melbourne is a 6 million, Victoria is a 6 million coming up to population, and the percentages don't shift that much. So there are a lot more people right on the edge. And if a funeral is the thing that tips them over, goodness me, don't we all pay the price if no one's there to help? So there's a greater social benefit to what we do than just the taking care of the funeral itself. I truly believe that.
It's interesting that you say that. I was in a meeting the other day and we each had to recall our earliest memory of when someone died. And it is always that impression that generally a grandchild has of a grandparent's funeral. And that is generally the first introduction someone has to death, if they're fortunate, or that is the sort of natural progression, that they've aged, they've died, and the grandchild attends that as a first introduction to death. And that's interesting with what you're saying, because that has a direct impact on that child, is how that funeral is held, how that person's life is celebrated, and it does have a huge flow-on effect. And these were all adult women and men in their 40s, 50s and 60s recalling these stories. So that has a very long-lived impact when you attend a funeral.
Yeah, it's amazing when it's a little bit scary too when you start to unravel what that looks like, and you realise, that there's, I can speak from personal experience. I won't, but that child is in a situation where all of a sudden something terrible has happened, is the way they perceive it. Because us Westerners, we're not real good with death. We don't like to acknowledge it very much. Certainly don't like thinking about it or planning it. That's just, for some reason, that's something that's crept in over the generations. So they don't get a lot. There's the kid. He doesn't get a lot of information, he or she. All of a sudden they realise there's a lot of tension and upset in the family, usually one side more than the other. Mum's crying a lot. Why? Dad's really angry. I can't understand why. Okay. Oh, well, grandma died. Grandpa died. Oh, okay. But they don't tell you very much else. In most cases, this is what happens. Then next thing you know, the bill or the possibility of a bill arrives, and boy, doesn't it erupt then if they're a family that are a little bit on the edge or only just have enough money to get by. Then the arguments start, then the fights. All sorts of things. Trauma is just building. It's building for everyone in the family. Most importantly, it's building at a formative phase for the child. And they associate that with death. And they get upset and they get angry and they act out at some point, as all children do, usually in your teenage years, sometimes all the way through into your 20s, maybe 30s. This stuff sits in there. Imagine if then you're in a situation where, even though money was a problem and mum and dad were upset and stressed out, that there was someone there to help them through, and that the child was allowed to be part of the organisation. They were allowed to sign the coffin with a coloured pen, for instance, or they were allowed to have some of their words included in the eulogy, or a little poem, maybe a little pressed flower. All these things are possible, and then they're not expensive. They just need people with heart and a little bit of time to make it get it right. We can do that. We do that. We're thinking about how we can do that for a lot more people, because all of a sudden there is a lot more people that are going to need that coming up.
And I know, Kieran, when we were planning Roland's funeral, it was the little stories when the children were deciding what to have as the flowers, or what to have as the food, or the music at his wake after he was cremated. It was those little things and the storytelling that actually meant that when we actually got to the memorial, it was still emotional, and we still had all of those feelings, but there wasn't that pressure cooker that you were actually referring to. We feel like we'd dealt with a few of those things by being able to tell those stories and share those stories.
Yeah, there's this real sense of relief and peace in the sharing, and a family that have the ability to open up their dialogue in a way, particularly at such a stressful event, that people can share in that way. and try to lift the spirits of others. Oh, I remember when Uncle Donald did this. Wasn't that so funny? Oh, goodness me. Oh, you should have seen the time he did these sorts of things. That's letting the steam out. That's the cathartic experience. At the same time, it's building the love for the deceased as well. Because let's face it, you rarely go through life where you have the same emotion about a person. It's up and it's down and it's upset and it's love. There's all sorts. And you tend to find the love coming through when the people are able to communicate how they're feeling about it and what they remember. It's a beautiful thing. That starts with the funeral director assisting the family in making the funeral happen, because that funeral director sets the pace and the ability for the people to do that. It's quite a skill set, It's very special what's being done, actually.
Suffering and grief are not necessarily trauma. Trauma is perhaps events of suffering and grief that are unexpected or extreme or come out of nowhere, and that's really what Kieran's talking about there. And I think you're right, Kieran. I think the preparation towards that event, it can be as sad as it might be, as it potentially can be, but what you don't want is an explosion in the middle of it that the children don't understand, and in fact people don't understand. That's the element of trauma. I think just picked up on something else that you said there too about people even in this age not being comfortable talking about death. And we probably don't have time today, and it's a bit off subject, but one of the most fascinating social psychological studies that I've ever looked at is around what they call mortality salience, or in plain English, being aware that you're going to die, which is perhaps a subject for another day. But it's the secret and the thing that we can address by talking more, and certainly by pre-planning funerals, or at least thinking about it. And some of the most usefully pre-planned funerals I've ever been engaged with is where the deceased said, I want to be buried, and this is my birthday, and let the family work the rest out. Here's
That's
the money
about as
to
simple
cover
as it gets.
Here's the money to cover it. I want to be buried. I want to be buried there next to grandma or whatever it is. Here's my name. Here's my details. They can work the rest out. And I learned that. Yeah, I had that experience directly with a very elderly guy, and I realised he was right. And I used to then not promote that, but I'd tell people about it. And most of the time I'd go out to pre-arrange a funeral with the family, and people would take 3 hours and I'd take 25 minutes. And the outcome was much, much better because, back to your first question, Catherine, funerals are for the living.
That's true. And is there any advice that you would like to share with the audience if they find themselves in a financially hard situation and they're facing a funeral, or do they need to put money aside? What's your suggestions? Kevin, I might start with you.
I was hoping you'd start with Kieran while I thought, but nevertheless, we'll have a crack.
You can take it in either turn, Kieran. It can go to you if you like.
I'm happy, Kev, if you want. I already know what I'm going to say.
Oh no, have a go. It's funny. They're the tone of wrap-up questions of interviews. What's your one piece of advice? And I'm based in Adelaide, and the Adelaide Fringe Festival's on, and I found myself in the city and the Fringe having a meal and in a very busy cafe, and there was a young couple sitting next to me and my friend who'd been together for many years, and he was a African man, and he said, "You look like you've been together a very great long time. What's the secret?" And I thought, how the hell can I tell you that? There is no one thing that I can tell you. So I'm not sure that there is one piece of advice that I've got. Thinking about or being consciously aware that you're going to die actually makes your life better. Not morbidly attracted to it. Don't sit down all day and contemplate your end. That makes it better. If money's a problem, I'm interested in crowdfunding funerals now, Catherine. I don't think I've thought about that too much until we've just talked to you. If you're a Victorian, I'd call our charity, actually, because as a charity, we aren't fighting commercially to conduct the funeral for your family. If we can help you, we do that. If we're not the best person to help you do that, we'll tell you we're not the best person to help you do that. It doesn't matter, because as a charity, and most charities, our funding is limited, and we want to deploy that funding. At this stage, it's almost like a triage where we say, what's the worst case? Who can we help who's in the most distress? And that's the history of this organisation for 27 years. And now what we're doing, of course, is saying there are people in a different sort of distress. How can we help them? How can we take what we have, the facilities we have, the capacities and the resources we have, and stretch it even further? It's Merlin the magician stuff, but we're about to do it.
Well, I'm going to be simple. I hope that's okay.
Sure.
I'm just going to say, folks, get onto the website, Critical Info, understand what it is you're involved in, and then contact us. And if you're still with us, organise it. We can do that for you. Get some information in the system so we know what we're doing for you. And if you're not with us and your next of kin has contacted us, be assured we'll take care of you.
Kieran and Kevin, I can't thank you enough for being guests on the podcast today. I look forward to our next chat.
Well, thank you, Catherine. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to reach a bigger audience to understand what it is we're providing. So thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Don't Be Caught Dead, brought to you by Critical Info. If you liked the episode, learnt something new, or were touched by a story you heard, we'd love for you to let us know. Send us an email, even tell your friends. Subscribe so you don't miss out on new episodes. If you can spare a few moments, please rate and review us, as it helps other people to find the show. Are you dying to know more? Stay up to date with Don't Be Caught Dead by signing up to our newsletter and follow us on social media. Head to don'tbecaughtdead.com for more information and loads of resources.